The morning of September 11, 1297, broke cold and damp over the Scottish lowlands. A thick mist clung to the river Forth, obscuring the muddy banks and the sprawling marshland that curved like a horseshoe around the town of Stirling. On the southern bank stood the might of the English crown, an army of roughly 20,000 men. Among them were heavily armored knights atop massive war horses, seasoned veterans of King Edward I's campaigns, and thousands of levied infantrymen. They were confident, they were well equipped, and they were commanded by men who believed they were marching not to a battle but to a police action against a rabble of rebellious peasants. On the northern bank, hidden in the dense trees of a rocky outcrop known as the Abbey Craig, waited a very different army, 6,000 men. Most were unarmored. They carried long ash spears, axes, and swords. They had no great cavalry, no siege engines, and no wealthy royal treasury to fund them. But they possessed two things the English army lacked: an intimate knowledge of the treacherous ground beneath their feet, and commanders who understood exactly how to turn the arrogance of an empire into a fatal weakness. History often remembers this clash through the distorted lens of romantic myth and Hollywood cinema. It paints a picture of blue-painted warriors charging blindly across open fields. But the true story of the Battle of Stirling Bridge is far more fascinating and far more brutal. It was not a victory won by wild fervor alone. It was a masterpiece of tactical patience, geographic exploitation, and psychological warfare. This is the story of how two Scottish commanders, William Wallace and Andrew Moray, lured a vastly superior invading force into a geographical choke point, waited for the perfect moment, and triggered a slaughter that would echo through the centuries. To understand the desperation and the sheer scale of the Scottish victory at Stirling Bridge, we must first look at the tragedy that brought the armies to the River Forth. The crisis began more than a decade earlier, on a stormy night in March 1286. King Alexander III of Scotland, after a day of meetings in Edinburgh, decided to ride back to his young wife across the Firth of Forth. The weather was foul, the night was pitch black, and his advisors begged him to wait for morning. But Alexander rode out anyway. He was separated from his guides in the dark, and the next morning, his body was found at the bottom of a steep, rocky embankment. His neck was broken. Alexander's sudden death plunged Scotland into a succession crisis. His only living heir was a 3-year-old granddaughter living in Norway, known as the Maid of Norway. When she tragically died on the voyage to claim her throne in 1290, the Scottish royal line was extinguished. Scotland was left kingless, with over a dozen noblemen stepping forward to claim the crown. Fearing civil war, the Guardians of Scotland made a fateful decision. They invited their powerful neighbor, King Edward I of England, to arbitrate the dispute. Edward I, known as Longshanks, was a brilliant, ruthless, and legally minded monarch. He had already conquered Wales and built a ring of iron castles to hold it. He did not come to Scotland merely to act as an impartial judge. Before he would even hear the claims, he demanded that the Scottish nobles recognize him as the Lord Paramount of Scotland. Desperate for stability and outmaneuvered by Edward's military presence on the border, the nobles agreed. Edward ultimately chose a man named John Balliol to be King of Scots. But it quickly became clear that Balliol was to be a puppet. Edward constantly undermined Balliol's authority, summoned him to English courts to answer petty lawsuits, and finally demanded that Scotland supply troops and funds for England's war against France. It was a humiliation too far. In 1295, the Scottish nobility stripped Balliol of his power, formed an alliance with France, the Auld Alliance, and prepared for war. Edward's response was swift and terrifying. In the spring of 1296, he marched north, sacked the wealthy merchant town of Berwick, slaughtering thousands of its inhabitants, and utterly crushed the Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar. He marched through Scotland unopposed, stripped John Balliol of his royal robes, and stole the Stone of Destiny, the ancient stone upon which Scottish kings were crowned. By the end of 1296, Scotland was not just a defeated nation, it was an occupied territory. English garrisons held the castles, English sheriffs collected the taxes, and Edward I returned to London, believing the Scottish problem was solved forever. He was wrong. The occupation of Scotland was harsh. Edward placed the country under the control of his trusted lieutenant, John de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey. But Surrey was old, tired, and complained that the Scottish climate was bad for his health. He retreated to northern England, leaving the day-to-day administration to his treasurer, Hugh de Cressingham. Cressingham was a clergyman, but he operated more like a merciless tax collector. He was deeply unpopular, described by chroniclers of the time as arrogant, greedy, and utterly contemptuous of the Scottish people. Under his administration, English soldiers roamed freely, seizing property, extorting locals, and committing abuses without fear of reprisal. In this environment of oppression, localized violence began to spark, but it took two very different men to fan those sparks into a national uprising. In the northeast of Scotland, a young nobleman named Andrew Moray escaped from an English prison. He returned to his family lands and immediately raised the standard of rebellion. Moray was a trained soldier, born into a powerful aristocratic family. He waged a highly effective guerrilla war, systematically capturing English-held castles across the Highlands and the Northeast, using speed, surprise, and deep local support. Meanwhile, in the Southwest, another figure emerged from the shadows. His name was William Wallace. Unlike Moray, Wallace was not a great lord. He was the younger son of a minor knight or landowner, though the exact details of his early life remain shrouded in mystery. What we do know is that in May 1297, Wallace led a daring raid on the town of Lanark and assassinated the English High Sheriff, William de Heselrigge. According to tradition, this was in retaliation for the murder of Wallace's wife or lover, though historical records cannot confirm the motive. Whatever the reason, the assassination made Wallace an outlaw and a hero. Men flocked to his banner. He was charismatic, physically imposing, and utterly uncompromising. While the senior Scottish nobility often played political games, submitting to Edward one month and rebelling the next to protect their lands, Wallace and Moray fought a war of total resistance. By the late summer of 1297, Wallace and Moray realized their localized rebellions needed to merge. They brought their forces together, creating an army of commoners, minor knights, and levied spearmen. They knew they could not defeat a full English army in a pitched battle on an open field. They needed a strategic advantage. They found it at Stirling. Stirling was the gateway to the Scottish Highlands. Dominated by a massive volcanic rock crowned with a formidable castle, the town sat beside the meandering River Forth. If you wanted to move an army from the south of Scotland to the north, you had to cross the Forth at Stirling. When news of the expanding Scottish rebellion reached King Edward in England, he was preoccupied with preparations for a war in France. He dismissed the uprising as a nuisance and ordered the Earl of Surrey, John de Warenne, to take an army north to crush the rebellion once and for all. Warenne marched into Scotland with a massive force. Estimates vary, but historical consensus places the English army at around 1,000 to 2,000 heavy cavalry and between 15,000 and 20,000 infantry, including devastatingly effective Welsh longbowmen. Wallace and Moray's army numbered roughly 6,000. The disparity was staggering. An army of this size, composed mostly of unarmored spearmen, should have been trampled into the mud by the English heavy cavalry within minutes. But Wallace and Moray arrived at Stirling first. They chose their ground with surgical precision. They positioned their men on the Abbey Crag, a steep, wooded hill about a mile north of the River Forth. From this vantage point, they had a perfect, unobstructed view of the river, the town, and the bridge. The geography of the River Forth at Stirling was unique. The river did not run in a straight line. It looped and coiled like a snake. The only crossing point was a wooden bridge. This was not a grand stone structure. It was a narrow timber bridge, built just wide enough for a horse and cart to cross. Contemporary accounts state that it was so narrow, only 2 horsemen could cross it abreast. Once across the bridge, the land on the northern bank did not open up into a wide plain. Instead, the river bent sharply, creating a loop, a pocket of marshy, soft ground connected to the bridge by an elevated causeway. The English army arrived on the southern bank in early September. From their position, they could see the Scottish army watching them from the wooded slopes of the Abbey Crag. John de Warenne, despite his age and lethargy, was an experienced military commander. He looked at the narrow bridge, looked at the marshy ground on the other side, and recognized a tactical nightmare. Sending thousands of men and heavy horses across a bottleneck while an enemy waited just a mile away was military suicide. But Warenne's caution was undermined by his treasurer Hugh de Cressingham. Cressingham was furious at the cost of maintaining the massive English army in the field. Every day they sat on the banks of the Forth, royal coin was being spent. He urged Warenne to attack immediately, arguing that to delay was a waste of the king's money and an insult to English honor. For several days, the English hesitated. They attempted negotiations. 2 Dominican friars were sent across the river to offer Wallace and Moray a pardon if they laid down their arms. Wallace's reply has echoed through history. "Tell your commander that we are not here to make peace, but to do battle, defend ourselves, and liberate our kingdom. Let them come on, and we shall prove this in their very beards." The trap was set. Now the Scots just had to wait for the English to walk into it. The morning of September 11th was a comedy of errors for the English command. The infantry awoke early and began crossing the narrow wooden bridge at dawn. Thousands of men shuffled across the timber planks, forming up on the northern bank. But they were recalled. The Earl of Surrey, their commander, had overslept. When Surrey finally woke, the army was ordered to cross again, but again they were halted. Surrey believed there was still a chance for negotiation, or perhaps he was hoping to find a ford further upriver to avoid the bottleneck of the bridge. A Scottish traitor in the English camp, Richard Lundy, warned Surrey not to use the bridge, offering to lead a cavalry detachment to a nearby ford to flank the Scots. Surrey hesitated, but once again Hugh de Cressingham intervened. Impatient, arrogant, and concerned only with the treasury, Cressingham effectively bullied the veteran commander into action. "It is not helpful to the king's business to waste the day," Cressingham reportedly argued. Reluctantly, Surrey gave the order. The English army would cross the bridge. From the high ground of the Abbey Crag, Wallace and Moray watched the spectacle unfold. They must have scarcely believed their luck. The English vanguard, led by Hugh de Cressingham and a seasoned knight named Marmaduke Thwang, began to cross. Because the bridge was so narrow, the crossing was agonizingly slow. It took hours for the heavy cavalry and the leading elements of the infantry to clatter across the wooden planks. As they crossed, they spilled out into the loop of the river, their heavy war horses sinking into the soft, boggy ground. Wallace and Moray did not attack immediately. This was the true genius of Stirling Bridge. In medieval warfare, the instinct of a defending army was often to hold the high ground or charge as soon as the enemy was in sight. But the Scottish commanders possessed iron discipline. They waited. They watched as 1,000 English soldiers crossed, then 2,000, then 3,000. They waited until a specific fatal threshold was crossed. Enough of the English army had crossed the bridge to constitute a devastating loss, but not so many that the Scottish force would be overwhelmed. Roughly 5,000 English soldiers, including a large contingent of heavy cavalry, were now packed into the marshy loop of land on the northern bank. Then a horn blasted from the Abbey Crag. The Scottish spearmen descended from the trees. They did not rush into a chaotic melee. They advanced in tight, disciplined formations known as schiltrons, dense blocks of men bristling with 12-foot ash spears. They did not aim for the center of the English line. They aimed straight for the causeway leading off the bridge. The speed of the Scottish advance caught the English entirely by surprise. Before the heavy cavalry could build up enough momentum for a charge in the marshy ground, the Scottish spearmen slammed into the bridgehead. In a matter of minutes, the trap snapped shut. The Scottish spear wall severed the English vanguard from the bridge. The men who had crossed were now trapped in a confined space. Behind them was the deep tidal water of the River Forth. In front of them, an impenetrable wall of Scottish spears. Total panic consumed the English vanguard. The heavy destriers, the tanks of the medieval battlefield, were useless without room to charge. Horses panicked, throwing their riders into the mud. English infantrymen were pushed backward by the sheer weight of the Scottish advance. Marmaduke Thwang, realizing the battle was lost the moment the bridgehead was taken, managed to carve his way back through the Scottish lines with a handful of knights, hacking his way across the bridge to safety. He was one of the very few to escape. For the rest of the vanguard, it was a slaughter. Cut off, surrounded, and with their backs to the river, the English vanguard disintegrated. Hundreds of heavily armored knights and soldiers were pushed into the swirling waters of the Forth, where the weight of their armor dragged them straight to the bottom. Those who stood their ground were impaled on the long spears of the Scottish schiltrons. Hugh de Cressingham, the arrogant treasurer who had demanded this attack, was pulled from his horse and killed in the mud. On the southern bank, the Earl of Surrey could only watch in horror. The bulk of his massive army was completely intact, standing mere hundreds of yards away, but they were entirely powerless to help. The bridge was blocked by the fighting and the fleeing. Realizing that his vanguard was utterly destroyed, and fearing that the victorious Scots might force their way across the bridge to attack his remaining troops, Surrey made a cowardly and catastrophic decision. He ordered the wooden bridge to be destroyed. He then turned his horse and fled, riding with such frantic speed that his horse was reportedly exhausted by the time he reached Berwick. He abandoned the rest of his army, leaving his infantry to fend for themselves as they retreated southward through hostile territory, harassed and hunted by Scottish forces all the way to the border. The Battle of Stirling Bridge was over. It was an annihilation. An army of commoners and minor nobles had wiped out a significant portion of the greatest military machine in Western Europe. But the victory came at a bitter price. During the brutal close-quarters fighting, Andrew Moray, the brilliant young tactician who had co-commanded the army, suffered a severe wound. He lingered for a few months, his name continuing to appear on official documents alongside Wallace's, but he eventually succumbed to his injuries in November of that year. History has often sidelined Moray, elevating William Wallace to the status of a solitary mythic hero. But military historians widely agree that the tactical brilliance of Stirling Bridge, the patience, the use of terrain, the disciplined spear formations, bore the hallmarks of Moray's formal military training just as much as Wallace's fierce leadership. The aftermath of the battle was grim. The Scots, brutalized by years of English occupation, took their revenge on the fallen. According to near-contemporary accounts, the body of Hugh de Cressingham was stripped, and his skin was flayed. It is said that Wallace took a strip of the hated treasurer's skin and used it to make a baldric, a strap for his sword. While this detail sounds like myth, It was widely reported by English chroniclers of the time, serving as a terrifying testament to the hatred Cressingham had inspired.